I discovered my neighbor's betrayal on a Tuesday morning when I found the certified letter taped to my front door, right above the brass knocker I had installed myself 3 years ago. The envelope bore the official seal of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. I had owned my property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive in suburban Denver, Colorado for 8 years, and in that time, I had carefully maintained every square inch of it. My name is Frank Whitmore, and I am not the kind of man who lets things slide into disrepair. My lawn stayed green through careful watering schedules. My fence received a fresh coat of stain every 2 years, and my gutters never held so much as a single leaf for more than a day or two. The letter informed me that I had violated Section 12, subsection D of the HOA covenants, which prohibited the visible storage of propane tanks from any street-facing view. I had 30 days to remedy the situation or face fines starting at $500 per week. The letter was signed by Barbara Kensington, the HOA president, whose looping signature seemed to curl with self-satisfaction across the bottom of the page. I stood there in my driveway, still holding my coffee mug, and read the letter 3 times. The propane tanks in question sat beside my house, clearly visible from the street. They were not decorative, but they were clean, upright, and necessary. 2 large tanks, each containing 100 gallons of propane, fed the heating systems for not just my own home, but also for the 2 rental properties I owned on the adjacent lots. Here is what made the situation particularly infuriating. Those tanks had been in that exact location for 8 years. 8 years without a single complaint. 8 years during which Barbara Kensington had driven past my house at least twice daily, given that she lived only 4 houses down from me. 8 years during which the HOA had never once mentioned this supposed violation during their quarterly inspections or annual compliance reviews. I walked back inside, set down my coffee, and pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants. I am a software engineer by trade, which means I am methodical and detail-oriented. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I responded. The document was 47 pages long, printed on cardstock, and bound with an excessive amount of brass fasteners. Section 12, subsection D did indeed state that propane tanks must not be visible from street view. However, there was no mention of enforcement timelines, no grandfather clause, and notably, no provision for what constituted reasonable compliance when the tanks served as the primary heating source for multiple properties. My phone rang. It was my tenant from 851 Maple Ridge, the house directly next to mine. "Frank, did you get some kind of letter from the HOA?" Marcus Chen sounded worried. He was a graduate student at the University of Colorado, Denver, studying chemical engineering, and he had been a model tenant for 2 years. "I did, about the propane tanks." "Yeah, same here. They left one on my door too, saying that as the occupant of a property in violation, I need to make sure the owner complies. Is this serious?" "It appears to be," I said. "Don't worry about it, I will handle it." After I hung up with Marcus, my phone rang again. This time it was Jennifer Rodriguez from 843 Maple Ridge, my other rental property. She was a nurse at Denver Health Medical Center, working night shifts, and she sounded exhausted. "Frank, I just woke up to this crazy letter about propane tanks." "What is going on?" I explained the situation as calmly as I could, assuring her that I would resolve it. But even as I spoke those words, I felt anger building in my chest. This was not about propane tanks. This was about something else entirely. 3 months earlier, I had attended an HOA meeting where Barbara Kensington proposed raising the annual dues from $800 to $1,500 per property. The increase was supposedly to fund a new community center, though the plans she presented were vague at best. I had voted against the measure and convinced several other homeowners to do the same. The motion failed by 2 votes. Barbara's face had turned the color of a ripe tomato, and she had stared directly at me as she adjourned the meeting. 2 months after that, I had filed a formal complaint about the HOA's landscaping contractor, who had repeatedly damaged my fence while mowing the common areas. The contractor happened to be Barbara's brother-in-law. My complaint had resulted in the HOA switching to a different company, which probably cost her brother-in-law about $20,000 per year in revenue. Now, suddenly, after 8 years of silence, my propane tanks were a critical violation requiring immediate attention. I called the propane company that afternoon. A cheerful woman named Susan answered and listened to my problem. "Well, the thing is," Susan said, "those tanks are positioned where they are because that is where your gas lines run. Moving them is not impossible, but it would require relocating all the underground lines, which would mean digging up a significant portion of your yard and the yards of your rental properties. We are probably talking about $15,000 to $20,000 in work, plus you would need to get permits from the county, and the work would take at least 2 weeks. During that time, you would have no heat to any of the properties. What if I just put up a screen or fence to block them from view? That might work, but you would need to make sure there is adequate ventilation and access for our service trucks. Propane tanks require specific clearances for safety reasons. If you box them in too tight, that creates a different set of problems." I thanked Susan and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and thought. The answer came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over the Rocky Mountains. My property was larger than most in the neighborhood. When I purchased it, the lot was nearly half an acre, which was unusual for this subdivision. The propane tanks currently sat on the north side of my house, visible from Maple Ridge Drive. However, the south side of my property backed up to a small utility easement, and then to the rear lots of the houses on the next street over, Oakmont Circle. If I moved the tanks to the rear of my property, they would no longer be visible from any street. They would be hidden behind my house and the houses of my rental properties. The catch, of course, was that the propane lines would need to be extended. But here is what made the situation interesting. Those lines currently ran from the tanks through an underground conduit that I owned and maintained. The conduit ran beneath all 3 properties, feeding the heating systems. I had installed this system myself when I purchased the rental properties, working with a licensed contractor to ensure everything met code. The entire setup was on my dime, my labor, and my responsibility. If I moved the tanks to the rear of the property, I would need to shut off the gas, drain the lines, and redirect everything. During that process, which would take at least a week, possibly 2, the rental properties would have no heat. My own house had a backup electric heating system that I had installed 2 years ago as a redundancy, but the rental properties relied entirely on propane. It was early November. Denver weather in November is unpredictable. We might have warm days in the 60s, or we might have sudden snowstorms that drop temperatures into the teens. My tenants would be uncomfortable, but not in danger, especially if I timed the work carefully and provided them with space heaters. I called Susan back at the propane company. "I want to move the tanks to the rear of my property. How quickly can we make that happen? Let me check with our installation team." I heard typing in the background. "Looks like we could start work next Wednesday, November 13th. We would need about 5 business days to complete everything, maybe a week to be safe. That would put us finishing around November 21st. What about permits? For a relocation on private property, where the tanks are moving more than 50 feet, you will need a permit from Jefferson County. That usually takes about 3 to 5 business days to process. You should apply right away. I thanked her and immediately drove to the Jefferson County permitting office. The clerk, a middle-aged man with glasses and a patient demeanor, reviewed my application. "This looks straightforward," he said. "You should have your permit by Friday, which gives you plenty of time before your installation date next Wednesday." "Perfect. Just make sure your tenants are informed. You are required to give them at least 72 hours notice before any work that interrupts essential services." I assured him I would handle all the notifications properly. Then I drove home and drafted letters to both Marcus and Jennifer, explaining that the propane tanks would be relocated to comply with HOA regulations, and that this work would require shutting off their heat from November 13th through approximately November 21st. I included information about space heaters, offered to reduce their rent for the month by 20%, and provided my cell phone number for any emergencies. Both tenants responded within hours, thanking me for the notice and the rent reduction. Marcus mentioned he would probably stay with his girlfriend during part of the work. Jennifer said she would manage with extra blankets and the space heater, and besides, she worked night shifts, so she would be sleeping during the day when it was warmer. On Friday, I received my permit from Jefferson County. On Monday, I sent a formal response to Barbara Kensington and the HOA, stating that I was taking immediate action to remedy the violation and that the propane tanks would be relocated by November 21st. I included a copy of my permit and a detailed timeline of the work. Barbara called me that evening. Her voice had the quality of someone trying very hard to sound reasonable while actually seething underneath. "Frank, I received your letter. I am glad you are taking this seriously." "I always take my responsibilities seriously, Barbara." "Yes, well, I wanted to make sure you understood that the 30-day deadline still applies. If those tanks are still visible from the street after December 10th, the fines will begin. They will be relocated by November 21st. That is 3 weeks ahead of your deadline." "Good." I also wanted to mention that several neighbors have expressed concerns about the appearance of your rental properties. The paint on 851 is looking a bit faded. That house was painted 2 years ago. The paint is fine. Perhaps you see it differently because you look at it every day. Fresh eyes notice these things. I took a deep breath. "Barbara, is there something specific you want to discuss?" "I am simply trying to maintain property values for everyone in the neighborhood, Frank. That is my job as HOA president. Your job is to enforce the covenants fairly and consistently. Those propane tanks have been in place for 8 years. Why are they suddenly a problem now?" There was a pause. When Barbara spoke again, her voice had lost its false sweetness. "The covenants are clear. Visible propane tanks are not permitted. The timeline of enforcement is at the discretion of the board." "I see. So selective enforcement based on personal grievances is official HOA policy now. I do not appreciate your tone, Frank. If you have concerns about HOA procedures, you are welcome to raise them at the next board meeting." She hung up before I could respond. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. The propane company crew showed up at 8 in the morning with a truck, tools, and 2 workers who looked like they had done this kind of job 100 times before. The lead worker, a man named Tom, walked the property with me and confirmed the plan. "We will start by shutting off the gas and draining the current lines," Tom explained. Then we will disconnect the tanks and move them to the rear location. After that, we dig the new trenches for the extended lines, lay the pipes, make all the connections, and test everything. If all goes well, we will be done by next Tuesday or Wednesday. Sounds good. By noon, the gas was off. The temperature outside was 48 degrees, comfortable enough. Inside the rental properties, the temperature would drop gradually over the coming days. I had already delivered space heaters to both Marcus and Jennifer, and both had confirmed they were managing fine. That afternoon, I saw Barbara Kensington drive slowly past my house. She stopped, stared at the work site where the crew was digging trenches, and then continued on. Her expression was unreadable behind her oversized sunglasses. Thursday brought colder weather. The temperature dropped to 35 degrees during the day and was forecast to reach 28 overnight. I texted both tenants to check in. Marcus confirmed he was staying with his girlfriend. Jennifer said she was fine, using the space heater and extra blankets, and honestly, she had grown up in Minnesota. So this was nothing. On Friday, Barbara left another notice on my door. This one cited a different covenant violation. The work equipment and materials in my yard constituted unsightly storage visible from the street and needed to be screened from view immediately. I crumpled the notice and threw it in the recycling bin. The weekend passed. The crew did not work weekends, so the trenches sat open. The tanks sat in their new location at the rear of the property, and the houses remained without heat. The weather turned genuinely cold. Saturday night dropped to 22 degrees. Sunday morning brought frost that glittered on every surface. I received a call from Jennifer on Sunday afternoon. "Hey Frank, just wanted to let you know I am heading out to stay with my sister for a few days. My space heater died and it is getting pretty chilly in here." "Not your fault. I know the work needs to be done. Just wanted you to know the house is empty." "I appreciate you letting me know. I will have the heat back on by Wednesday at the latest." "No worries. See you then." Marcus had already confirmed he was staying away until the work was complete. Both properties now sat empty and cold. Monday morning, the crew returned and worked with efficient focus. By evening, they had laid all the new gas lines and were beginning the connection work. Tom assured me they would finish on schedule. Tuesday afternoon, Barbara appeared at my door. She was wearing a long wool coat and holding a clipboard, which I recognized as the official HOA inspection form. "Frank, I need to conduct a compliance inspection of your property." "For what purpose?" "Random inspections are permitted under Section 8 of the covenants." I stepped aside and let her in. She walked through my house with exaggerated attention to detail, making notes on her clipboard. When she finished, she turned to me. "Your property appears to be in compliance. However, I noticed that your rental properties are currently vacant. Are you aware that under Section 15, properties must be occupied or actively listed for sale or rent? Vacant properties decrease neighborhood security and property values. The properties are not vacant. They have tenants. Those tenants are temporarily staying elsewhere while I complete the propane tank relocation that your HOA demanded." Barbara's mouth formed a tight line. "I see. And when will this work be completed?" "Tomorrow. The crew is finishing today and will conduct final testing and startup tomorrow." "Tomorrow is November 19th. You said the work would be complete by November 21st. You are ahead of schedule." "Yes." "That is good." She paused at my door. "You know, Frank, this adversarial relationship is not necessary. The HOA exists to help everyone maintain their property values. We are all on the same team." "Barbara, I have lived here for 8 years without any violations or complaints. I voted against a dues increase that had no clear justification, and I filed a legitimate complaint about property damage." If that makes me adversarial in your eyes, then I think the problem is not with me." Her expression hardened. "The board will be discussing your properties at our next meeting. You might want to attend." She left, and I closed the door perhaps slightly harder than necessary. Wednesday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-30s. The propane crew completed their final connections, ran all the safety tests, and fired up the systems. Gas flowed through the new lines, furnaces ignited, and heat began flowing into all 3 properties. Tom walked me through the final inspection. "Everything is perfect. The tanks are secure, all connections are tight, no leaks, pressure is exactly where it should be. You are good to go." I signed off on the work, paid the remaining balance, and watched the crew drive away. The total cost had been $18,000, not counting the reduced rent I had given my tenants. But the propane tanks were now completely invisible from any street view, tucked behind the buildings where only someone standing in the utility easement could see them. I called Marcus and Jennifer to let them know the heat was back on. Both thanked me and said they would be moving back in that evening. Then I drafted a formal letter to the HOA, attaching photos of the relocated tanks, copies of all permits and final inspections, and a detailed timeline of the completed work. I hand-delivered the letter to Barbara's house. She answered the door in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, looking annoyed at the interruption. "What is this?" "Documentation that the propane tank violation has been remedied 3 weeks ahead of your deadline. The tanks are no longer visible from any street view. All work was completed with proper permits and inspections. You should find everything in order." Barbara took the envelope without looking at it. "I will review this with the board." "Please do." "And Barbara, if the board plans to discuss my properties at your next meeting, I want advance notice of the agenda items and the opportunity to respond." "That is standard procedure." "Good. Then I will see you at the meeting." I turned and walked back to my house, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. The tanks were moved, the violation was resolved, and I had complied with every rule and regulation. Surely this would be the end of it. I was, of course, completely wrong. The following Monday, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This one informed me that I was being fined $1,500 for the unsightly storage of construction materials visible from the street during the week of November 13th through November 19th. The fine was based on 3 separate days when an HOA board member observed construction equipment, materials, and open trenches in my yard. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter 4 times. The level of petness was almost impressive. The construction materials had been necessary and temporary, present only during the work that the HOA had required me to complete. Fining me for the visible evidence of compliance was circular logic taken to an absurd extreme. I called a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Stern, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Denver, in one of those older buildings with good bones and high ceilings. Rebecca was in her 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Tell me everything," she said after I sat down in her office. I walked her through the entire timeline. The initial propane tank violation letter, the history of my disputes with Barbara Kensington, the relocation work, and now the fine for construction materials. Rebecca listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is selective enforcement, and it is actionable. The HOA cannot target you for violations that they ignore in other homeowners, and they cannot fine you for temporary conditions that result from work they required you to perform. However, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. Before we go down that road, I want to understand your goals. Do you want to stay in this neighborhood long term, or are you thinking about selling? I want to stay. I have 8 years invested in these properties. My tenants are happy, and I am not going to let Barbara Kensington bully me into leaving. Rebecca smiled. Good. Then here is what we are going to do. First, you are going to document everything. Every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every conversation. Start a detailed log with dates, times, and witnesses. Second, we are going to file a formal dispute of this fine, citing the selective enforcement and the unreasonable nature of the charge. Third, we are going to attend the next HOA board meeting and make your case publicly. HOAs hate publicity, and they hate having their decisions questioned in front of the community. Sometimes that is enough to make them back down. And if they do not back down, then we file suit for harassment and selective enforcement. Colorado law is actually pretty favorable to homeowners in these situations, especially when there is clear evidence of personal animus driving the HOA's actions. I hired Rebecca on the spot and left her office feeling cautiously optimistic. She was right about documentation. I went home and started a detailed spreadsheet of every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every fine, every conversation. The pattern was obvious. Before my opposition to the dues increase, I had 0 violations in 8 years. After my opposition, I had multiple violations and fines in less than 4 months. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, December 5th at 7 in the evening at the Meadowbrook Hills Community Center. I marked it on my calendar and began preparing what I would say. But before that meeting could happen, something unexpected occurred. On Tuesday, December 3rd, I came home from work to find both Marcus and Jennifer standing in my driveway, looking worried. "Frank, we have got a problem," Marcus said. "The heat is not working." "What do you mean?" "We just had everything reconnected last week." "I know, but this morning I woke up and the house was freezing. I checked the thermostat and it is set to 70, but the temperature inside is 55. I can hear the furnace trying to kick on, but nothing is happening." Jennifer nodded. "Same thing at my place. No heat since this morning." I walked over to Jennifer's property first and checked the furnace. It was trying to ignite but failing. The propane was not flowing. I checked the tank gauge and it showed 3/4 full. I walked to Marcus's property and found the exact same situation. Then I walked to the rear of my property where the tanks were located. What I found made my blood pressure spike. Someone had turned off the main shutoff valves on both tanks that fed the rental properties. The valve on my personal tank, which fed my house, was still open, but the 2 valves feeding Marcus's and Jennifer's houses had been deliberately closed. I turned the valves back on, waited for the lines to pressurize, and then went back to both rental properties. Within 10 minutes, the furnaces fired up and heat began flowing again. "Someone turned off your gas," I told Marcus and Jennifer. "The valves were manually shut off." "Who would do that?" Jennifer asked. I did not answer, but I had a pretty good idea. The tanks were now located at the rear of my property, out of sight from any street. The only people who would even know they were there were me, my tenants, the propane company, and anyone who had specifically gone looking for them. I called the propane company and asked if they had sent anyone to service the tanks. They had not. I asked if there was any reason the valves would close on their own. They said no, those were manual valves that required intentional turning. Then I did something I should have done weeks ago. I called a security company and ordered cameras to be installed covering all 3 properties, with special attention to the area around the propane tanks. The cameras were installed the next day, Wednesday, December 4th. They were high definition, motion activated and connected to my phone so I would receive alerts whenever they detected movement. Thursday evening, I drove to the community center for the HOA board meeting. Rebecca Stern met me in the parking lot. Remember, stay calm and stick to the facts. Do not let them provoke you into an emotional response. Emotion makes you look unreasonable. Facts and documentation make them look unreasonable. The community center was a bland, single-story building with beige walls and fluorescent lighting. About 20 homeowners were already seated in folding chairs when I arrived. Barbara Kensington sat at a table in the front, flanked by 4 other board members. She watched me enter with an expression that tried for neutral but landed somewhere closer to smug. The meeting began with standard business: approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a financial report, a discussion about holiday decorations in the common areas. Then Barbara reached the agenda item I had been waiting for. Next, we need to address the ongoing compliance issues with properties at 847, 851, and 843 Maple Ridge Drive, owned by Frank Whitmore. Frank, would you like to address the board? I stood and walked to the front of the room. Rebecca remained seated but gave me an encouraging nod. Thank you, Barbara. As you know, I received a violation notice in early November regarding the visibility of propane tanks on my property. I immediately took action to remedy that violation, relocating the tanks at considerable personal expense and inconvenience to my tenants. The work was completed ahead of the deadline you provided, with all proper permits and inspections. The tanks are now completely out of view from any street. However, I then received a fine for temporary construction materials that were visible during the work your violation notice required me to complete. This seems like an unreasonable and contradictory enforcement action. Barbara shuffled some papers. The fine for construction materials is separate from the propane tank violation. The covenants are clear that unsightly materials cannot be stored in view of the street. These were not stored materials. They were active construction supplies for a project that took 1 week. Are you saying that any homeowner who needs to complete repairs or improvements cannot have any visible evidence of that work, even temporarily? One of the other board members, a man named Gregory, spoke up. The covenant language does not distinguish between temporary and permanent storage. Rebecca stood. May I address the board? My name is Rebecca Stern, and I am Mr. Whitmore's legal counsel. The covenant language may not make that distinction, but Colorado case law does. In Homestead Acres v. Patterson, the Colorado Court of Appeals ruled that HOAs cannot penalize homeowners for temporary conditions resulting from reasonable maintenance activities. Furthermore, HOAs cannot use covenant enforcement as a tool for harassment or retaliation. The pattern of enforcement actions against Mr. Whitmore, coming immediately after he opposed a board initiative and filed a legitimate complaint about contractor negligence, creates a clear appearance of selective enforcement. The room went very quiet. Several homeowners turned to look at Barbara. Her face had gone pale. We do not retaliate against homeowners, Barbara said, her voice tight. Every enforcement action has been based on legitimate covenant violations. Then you should be able to provide records of similar enforcement actions against other homeowners, Rebecca said. For example, the property at 892 Oakmont Circle has a visible air conditioning unit that violates the same section of the covenants as Mr. Whitmore's propane tanks. The property at 734 Maple Ridge has stored construction materials in the driveway for 3 weeks. The property at 821 Oakmont Circle has multiple external storage containers visible from the street. Yet none of these properties have received violation notices. Why is that? Barbara looked at the other board members. Gregory cleared his throat. We address violations as they are brought to our attention by community members. So your enforcement is based on complaints rather than systematic inspection? Rebecca asked. That is itself a violation of the HOA's duty to enforce covenants uniformly. A woman in the audience raised her hand. I have a question. Why are we even discussing Frank's properties? He fixed the problem with the propane tanks. It seems like the issue should be resolved. Several other homeowners murmured in agreement. Barbara tried to regain control of the meeting. The issue is not just the propane tanks. There is a pattern of Mr. Whitmore pushing back against reasonable HOA oversight. As board members, we have a fiduciary duty to maintain property values for all homeowners, and that requires consistent enforcement of the covenants. Consistent enforcement would be great, I said, but what I am experiencing is targeted harassment. I have lived here for 8 years without a single violation. I vote against one dues increase and suddenly I am buried in notices and fines. That is not about property values. That is personal. An older man in the back stood up. I voted against that dues increase too. Should I expect to start getting violation notices? The meeting dissolved into overlapping conversations. Homeowners were questioning the board, arguing with each other, and generally creating chaos. Barbara tried to restore order by calling for a vote on my fine. But Rebecca immediately objected that no vote could be taken without proper notice to all homeowners, which had not been provided. The meeting ended without any resolution, but as I walked back to my car, several homeowners approached me to offer their support. One woman said she had been fighting the HOA over a fence color for 6 months. Another man said the board had tried to fine him for parking his work truck in his own driveway. Barbara runs this HOA like it is her personal kingdom, he said. It is about time someone stood up to her. Rebecca walked with me to my car. That went well. You have community support, which is huge. Barbara looked rattled, which means she knows her position is weak. I expect they will drop the fine rather than risk a legal battle. What about the propane tank thing? Someone is still messing with my equipment. Install those cameras. If it happens again and you catch them on video, that is trespassing and vandalism. Criminal charges would end this whole situation very quickly. I drove home feeling better than I had in weeks. The cameras were already installed and active. If Barbara or anyone else from the HOA came near my property again, I would have proof. 3 days later, at 2:30 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the cameras. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and opened the security app. The camera covering the rear of my property showed a figure approaching the propane tanks. The person was wearing dark clothing and a hoodie, but the infrared camera captured every detail. I watched as the figure reached the tanks and began turning off the shut-off valves, the same valves that fed heat to the rental properties. The figure worked quickly, turning off both valves, and then walked away from the camera toward the utility easement. I had crystal-clear video of someone sabotaging my property. The motion alert had also saved a clip of the person's arrival. I scrolled back and watched the figure approach from the direction of Maple Ridge Drive, walking across my property with obvious familiarity with the layout. The person glanced back once toward the street, and the camera caught a partial view of the face under the hoodie. It was Barbara Kensington. I got out of bed and pulled on jeans and a jacket. Then I walked outside to the propane tanks and turned the valves back on. As I did so, I heard a car start somewhere nearby and drive away quickly. I went back inside and sat at my kitchen table, watching the video clip again. There was no question about the identity. The face was clearly visible for 2 seconds when Barbara looked back toward the street. The timestamp, location, and motion tracking were all embedded in the video file. Barbara Kensington, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, had trespassed on my property in the middle of the night and sabotaged heating equipment that served occupied rental units. I sent the video to Rebecca Stern with a message. Got her. Rebecca called me at 7 in the morning. Frank, this is serious. What she did is criminal. Trespassing, vandalism, possibly reckless endangerment if those rental units had been occupied during freezing weather. You need to file a police report. Will they actually do anything with video evidence this clear? Absolutely. This is not a civil HOA dispute anymore. This is criminal activity. I called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation. A deputy arrived at my house within an hour. His name was Deputy Martinez, and he was professional and thorough. I showed him the video, explained the history of the HOA disputes, and provided documentation of everything that had happened. Mr. Whitmore, this is definitely trespassing and criminal mischief at minimum. The fact that she tampered with heating equipment serving occupied dwellings could potentially bump this up to a more serious charge. I am going to need to take a copy of this video and file a report. Someone from the detective division will follow up with you. What happens next? A detective will review the evidence and decide whether to file charges. Given the clarity of the video and the nature of the offense, I would say charges are very likely. The district attorney will make the final call. Deputy Martinez left with a copy of the video. I called Marcus and Jennifer to let them know what had happened and that their heat might be affected again, but that I was dealing with it through legal channels now. Both were shocked that the HOA president had been sabotaging their heat. That is insane, Marcus said. What if we had been home? What if it had been colder? I am handling it. The police are involved now. 2 days later, a detective named Sarah Park called me. She asked to meet at my house to review the evidence and take a formal statement. She arrived that afternoon in an unmarked car, wearing plain clothes and carrying a notebook. Mr. Whitmore, I have reviewed the video from Deputy Martinez. Before we proceed, I want to understand the full context of your dispute with Miss Kensington. I walked Detective Park through everything. The dues increase vote, the damaged fence complaint, the sudden violation notices, the fine for construction materials, the board meeting, and finally the 2 incidents of the propane valves being shut off. The first time the valves were shut off, you did not have video, correct? The cameras were not installed yet. But you suspected Miss Kensington. I suspected someone from the HOA, yes. The tanks are at the rear of my property out of sight. The only people who would know they were there are me, my tenants, the propane company, and anyone who came looking for them specifically. Detective Park made notes. And the second incident, you have full video of Miss Kensington approaching the tanks and turning off the valves. Yes. The video is time-stamped and shows her face clearly. Have you had any contact with Miss Kensington since this incident? No. I sent the video to my lawyer and called the police. I have not spoken to Barbara. Good. Here is what is going to happen. I am going to forward this case to the district attorney with a recommendation to file charges for criminal trespass and criminal mischief. Depending on how the DA's office views the endangerment aspect, there may be additional charges. Miss Kensington will be contacted and given the opportunity to respond. This will likely result in a court summons. How long does that process take? A few weeks, typically. In the meantime, I would recommend you have no contact with Miss Kensington and continue documenting any further incidents. Detective Park left, and I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that the situation was being taken seriously by law enforcement, but anxiety about what would happen next. This had escalated far beyond what I had imagined when I first received that violation letter back in November. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, January 9th. I received the agenda by email, and there was no mention of my properties or any outstanding issues. I suspected that Barbara was trying to avoid further public confrontation, especially now that the police were involved. But 3 days before that meeting, I received a call from Gregory, the board member who had spoken at the previous meeting. "Frank, this is Gregory Paulson from the HOA board. I wanted to reach out to you privately before the next meeting. I am listening. Look, several of us on the board have become aware of the situation with Barbara. The police contacted her last week about the incident at your property. She is obviously not handling this well. She has asked for a leave of absence from the board, citing personal stress." "I see. The rest of us have been reviewing the enforcement actions against your properties, and frankly, we agree with your lawyer. The pattern of targeting is pretty clear. We would like to rescind the fine for construction materials and formally apologize for the way this situation has been handled. We want to resolve this without further legal action." "Gregory, I appreciate that, but the bigger issue is not the fine. The bigger issue is that Barbara Kensington came onto my property in the middle of the night and sabotaged equipment that provides heat to occupied rental units. That is not an HOA matter anymore. That is a criminal matter. I understand, and for what it is worth, the board is cooperating fully with the police investigation. We are as shocked as you are by Barbara's actions. If the board is serious about resolving this, here is what I need. First, a formal letter rescinding the fine and acknowledging that the enforcement actions against my properties were inappropriate. Second, a written commitment to uniform enforcement of the covenants across all properties in the neighborhood. Third, Barbara's permanent removal from the board, not just a leave of absence. I can commit to the first two right now. The third will require a vote of the full board, but I do not think you will find much resistance. Barbara has lost the confidence of the other board members. Then we can move forward. Send me that letter and I will have my lawyer review it." Gregory sounded relieved. "Thank you, Frank. We will get that to you by tomorrow." The letter arrived the next day, signed by all 4 remaining board members. It rescinded the fine, acknowledged that enforcement had been inconsistent, and committed to developing clear procedures for uniform covenant enforcement. Rebecca reviewed it and said it was acceptable. On January 9th, I attended the HOA board meeting. The community center was more crowded than usual, word having spread through the neighborhood about the conflict between me and Barbara. Barbara was not present. Gregory chaired the meeting in her absence. "Before we begin regular business, the board wants to address the situation involving Frank Whitmore and the former board president, Barbara Kensington. As many of you know, there has been an ongoing dispute regarding enforcement actions against Mr. Whitmore's properties. After careful review, the board has determined that those enforcement actions were not consistent with how we have treated similar situations involving other homeowners. We have rescinded all fines against Mr. Whitmore and committed to developing clearer enforcement procedures going forward." Gregory paused and looked directly at me. "We also want to apologize to Mr. Whitmore for the way this situation was handled. The HOA board exists to serve the community, not to target individual homeowners. We failed in that responsibility, and we are taking steps to ensure it does not happen again." Several homeowners applauded. Gregory continued. "Additionally, Barbara Kensington has resigned from the board effective immediately. We will be holding a special election to fill her position next month. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to shake my hand and express their support. The woman who had been fighting over her fence color thanked me for standing up to Barbara. The man with the work truck said he hoped the board would actually follow through on uniform enforcement. I drove home feeling like a significant weight had been lifted. The HOA situation was resolved, my properties were in compliance, and I had support from the community. But the criminal case against Barbara was still pending, and I knew that would take time to work through the system. In mid-February, Detective Park called me again. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to let you know that the district attorney has filed charges against Barbara Kensington. She is being charged with criminal trespass, criminal mischief, and reckless endangerment. The endangerment charge is because she shut off heating equipment serving occupied dwellings during winter months when temperatures were below freezing. She has been issued a summons to appear in court. What happens now? She will be arraigned, and then the case will proceed. Given the strength of the evidence, I expect her attorney will recommend a plea deal. Most first-time offenders in cases like this plead to reduced charges in exchange for probation and restitution. How long does that take? Could be a few months. I will keep you updated." The months passed. Winter gave way to spring. My rental properties remained occupied and problem-free. The new HOA board followed through on their commitment to develop clear enforcement procedures, and I was even asked to serve on the committee that drafted them. I declined, having had enough of HOA politics to last me a lifetime, but I reviewed the proposed procedures and found them fair and reasonable. In late April, Rebecca Stern called me with news. Barbara Kensington took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to criminal trespass and criminal mischief. The reckless endangerment charge was dropped as part of the agreement. She received 1 year of probation, 100 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay you restitution for the cost of installing the security cameras. What about jail time? None. First offense, and frankly, the judge probably saw this as a civil dispute that went too far rather than serious criminal behavior. The probation and restitution are pretty standard for this kind of case. Does she have to stay away from me? The probation terms include a no-contact order. She cannot come near you or your properties for the duration of her probation. I felt a sense of closure. It was not perfect justice, but it was enough. Barbara had faced consequences for her actions, the HOA had reformed its practices, and my properties were secure. In early May, I received a check from Barbara's attorney for $1,800, reimbursing me for the security camera installation. Attached to the check was a brief letter. "Mr. Whitmore, please accept this restitution as ordered by the court. I acknowledge that my actions were inappropriate, and I regret the distress I caused you and your tenants. Sincerely, Barbara Kensington." I deposited the check and filed the letter with the rest of my documentation. I did not respond to it. There was nothing left to say. Marcus finished his degree at the University of Colorado, Denver, and moved out in June, but he recommended a friend who needed a place to rent, and the transition was seamless. Jennifer continued working at Denver Health Medical Center and remained a model tenant. The propane tanks sat in their new location behind my property, invisible from the street, providing reliable heat to all 3 houses. The cameras remained active, though they mostly recorded nothing more interesting than the occasional deer or raccoon passing through the utility easement. On a warm evening in late July, I was grilling dinner on my back patio when I noticed a for sale sign go up in front of Barbara Kensington's house, 4 doors down. I watched through the fence as a real estate agent hammered the sign into the lawn. Within a week, the house sold. I never saw Barbara again. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler, introduced themselves to the neighborhood at a community barbecue in August. They seemed friendly and normal. The husband mentioned he had heard there had been some HOA drama before they moved in, but that everything seemed calm now. "Yeah," I said. "It got a little tense for a while, but things are better now." Life in Meadowbrook Hills returned to its previous quiet rhythm. The HOA focused on actual community issues, maintaining the common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and enforcing the covenants uniformly and fairly. I attended occasional meetings but mostly kept to myself, content to manage my properties and live peacefully. Looking back on the entire experience, from that first violation letter in November to Barbara's guilty plea in April, I realized several things. First, HOAs can be valuable organizations when run by reasonable people focused on genuine community interests, but they can also become tools for petty tyrants to exercise control over their neighbors. Second, documentation is everything. Without the detailed records I kept and the video evidence from the cameras, the situation would have been my word against Barbara's, and the outcome could have been very different. Third, standing up to bullies matters, even when it is expensive and stressful. Barbara counted on me backing down rather than fighting. When I did not, her entire strategy collapsed. The propane tanks that started this whole mess continued to do their job quietly and efficiently, hidden from view but essential to keeping 3 households warm through Colorado winters. They were just machines, metal cylinders filled with compressed gas, but they had become symbols of something larger. The right to use your own property in reasonable ways without harassment, the importance of fair and consistent rules, and the necessity of accountability when those in authority abuse their power. I never regretted moving those tanks, even though it cost me $18,000 and months of stress. The principle was worth defending. Property rights mean nothing if they can be arbitrarily violated by whoever holds a position of nominal authority. Barbara learned that lesson the hard way, through criminal charges and public embarrassment. The HOA learned it through community backlash and the need to rebuild trust. And I learned that sometimes the only way to deal with unreasonable people is to refuse to be intimidated, document everything, and let the facts speak for themselves. The story could have ended differently. If I had simply paid the fines and accepted Barbara's harassment, she would have continued targeting me until I either sold my properties or gave up fighting. If I had responded with anger and confrontation instead of calm documentation and legal process, I would have looked like the unreasonable one. If I had not installed those cameras, Barbara might have continued sabotaging my equipment without consequences. But each decision I made, from hiring Rebecca Stern to installing the security system to attending those board meetings, moved the situation toward a just resolution. By September, almost a year after that first violation letter, life felt completely normal again. My tenants were happy, my properties were in excellent condition, and the HOA functioned as it should. As a neutral organization managing shared resources and enforcing agreed-upon rules fairly. The conflict with Barbara had receded into neighborhood history, a cautionary tale about what happens when personal grievances drive organizational decisions. I still owned those 3 properties on Maple Ridge Drive. The propane tanks still sat behind them, out of sight, doing their job. The security cameras still recorded the occasional deer. And I still lived peacefully in a neighborhood that had learned, through an unfortunate but necessary conflict, the importance of fairness, accountability, and respect for property rights. Sometimes, I would walk past the house where Barbara had lived and think about how differently things might have gone. If she had been reasonable from the start, if she had not taken my votes and complaints personally, if she had not decided to wage a campaign of harassment against me, none of the subsequent events would have happened. She would still be HOA president. I would have kept my propane tanks in their original location, and we would have been neighbors without incident. But she made her choices, and those choices had consequences. The whole experience taught me something valuable about human nature and power. People who seek positions of authority in organizations like HOAs often do so because they crave control over others. When that control is challenged, they react badly. Barbara could not tolerate the idea that I, or any other homeowner, might question her decisions or oppose her initiatives. She saw the HOA not as a service organization, but as her personal domain. When I refused to submit to her authority, she escalated until she crossed the line from petty harassment into actual criminal behavior. But the experience also taught me something hopeful. Systems work if you let them. The legal system, the HOA's own governance structure, and the community itself all functioned as they should when faced with clear evidence of wrongdoing. Barbara was held accountable, the HOA reformed its practices, and justice was served. It took time and money and effort, but the outcome was right. As autumn arrived again, bringing cooler temperatures and the need to fire up the heating systems for another winter, I checked the propane tanks and made sure everything was in perfect working order. The tanks were full, the lines were clear, the connections were tight. Everything worked exactly as it should. I stood there in the utility easement behind my property, looking at those two large metal cylinders, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These tanks had been the catalyst for months of conflict, but they were also the reason Barbara's abuse of power had finally been exposed and stopped. By forcing me to move them, she had forced me to document everything, install cameras, hire a lawyer, and fight back. Her overreach had been her undoing. The snow would come soon. The temperatures would drop. The furnaces would run through the long Colorado winter. And those propane tanks, invisible from any street view but essential to the comfort and safety of my tenants, would do their job without drama or incident, just as they should. I walked back to my house, made myself dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted over fences, and the streetlights came on as darkness fell. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be. A place where people lived their lives without interference or harassment, where rules were enforced fairly, and where conflicts were resolved through proper channels rather than personal vendettas. That night, as I got ready for bed, I checked my phone one last time. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, just the empty space behind my property, the propane tank standing silent in the darkness. I set my phone on the nightstand and turned off the light, satisfied that everything was as it should be. My property was secure, my tenants were comfortable, and justice had been served. The HOA saga was over. Barbara Kensington was gone. The propane tanks were exactly where they needed to be. And I had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand your ground, document everything, and let the truth speak for itself. It had been expensive, stressful, and time-consuming, but it had been worth it. Because at the end of the day, principles matter, property rights matter, fairness matters, and accountability matters. I fell asleep that night knowing I had done the right thing, knowing that I had protected not just my own interests, but the interests of every homeowner who might face similar harassment in the future. The new HOA board's commitment to fair enforcement would protect others from what I had experienced. Barbara's criminal conviction would serve as a warning to anyone else who might think they could abuse their authority without consequences. And my willingness to fight back, to document everything, to hire a lawyer and install cameras and attend meetings and file police reports, had made all the difference. The propane tanks that had started this entire conflict continued to do their simple job, storing fuel, providing heat, keeping my tenants comfortable through the cold Colorado winters. They were just machines, but they had become something more through the conflict they inadvertently sparked. They were symbols of property rights defended, of bullies confronted, of justice served. And every time I walked past them, tucked away behind my property where no street view could see them, I felt a quiet pride in having stood my ground. The neighborhood moved forward. New families arrived, old families left, seasons changed, and life continued. But the lesson remained. HOAs exist to serve communities, not to enable petty tyrants. When they forget that purpose, when individual board members use their positions to settle personal scores or exercise control over their neighbors, they must be held accountable. And sometimes, that accountability comes in the form of criminal charges, public embarrassment, and permanent removal from power. Barbara Kensington had learned that lesson. The HOA had learned that lesson. And I had learned that standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult and expensive, is always worthwhile. The propane tanks were exactly where they needed to be. My properties were secure and well-maintained, and my tenants were happy. Everything had worked out exactly as it should, because I had refused to be bullied into submission, and had instead fought back through proper legal channels with careful documentation and professional representation. That was the real victory, not just resolving my own situation, but establishing a precedent that would protect others. The new enforcement procedures, the community's awareness of the importance of fair governance, and Barbara's very public downfall all served as protection for future homeowners who might otherwise face similar harassment. By fighting back, I had made the neighborhood safer and fairer for everyone. As winter settled over Denver and the propane tanks worked steadily to keep 3 households warm, I knew that the entire experience, as unpleasant as it had been, had ultimately strengthened both my resolve and my community. Sometimes conflict is necessary. Sometimes standing up to authority is the only way to ensure that authority remains accountable. And sometimes, a simple dispute over propane tanks can become a much larger story about justice, fairness, and the importance of defending your rights even when doing so is difficult. The tanks sat behind my property, invisible and essential, exactly as they should be. And I lived peacefully in my neighborhood, vindicated and secure, knowing that I had done the right thing. That knowledge was worth more than any amount of money or convenience. It was the knowledge that when faced with injustice, I had not backed down. I had stood my ground and I had won.